Hey everybody, Assalamu alaikum. We're going to be playing Clear Obscure Expedition 33 today. The game is stunning. The art style, the story, the whole atmosphere just pulls you in. But while we play this, I'm going to talk to you about something. It's something I've been reading about, watching closely, and reflecting on for over a decade. And the more I sit with it, the more urgent it feels to talk about it. I'm talking about masculinity, colonialism, and the stories we inherit shape how we act, how we lead, even how we read the Quran. I've been thinking a lot about how I grew up, how the messaging around masculinity kept shifting. Over the past 20 years, I've seen that idea evolve in real life, in media, in books. From the post 9/11 surveillance culture to the 2008 financial crisis to the rise of the manosphere after Gamergate, each moment added a new layer on how manhood is narrated. Somewhere along the way, those narratives started seeping into how we understand the word Qawwamah in Arabic. We're told that men are built to lead, built to provide, and often Islam was used to back that up. But when you trace that idea throughout Tafsir, colonial history, the systems we live under, something disturbing emerges. The roles we defined as sacred often echo the very logic of surveillance, war, and domination, the systems that dehumanize the very people we claim to protect. Here's the question that's been on my mind for at least 2 years now. What if the masculine ideal we're defending is the same logic used to justify drones, prisons, and the logic of al-Jabarūt against Palestinian men? I know it's a heavy question, but it's one we have to ask. Because what if the frameworks we call Islamic are actually echoing the very systems that dehumanize the people we pray for day in and day out? Let me explain to you why I use the word al-Jabarūt. The Arabic root jim ba ra carries meanings of force, compulsion, and domination. In the Quran, the word Jabbar is never used positively for humans. It's used for tyrants like Pharaoh, for arrogant figures who overpower others through force. And Allah consistently condemns this kind of domination, especially when it silences truth or persecutes the innocent. But El Jabarut is more than just a tyrant. It's a logic, a system, a whole worldview built on overwhelming coercive power. So when I say the logic of El Jabarut, I'm talking about the system that sees Palestinian men as threats to be neutralized, not humans to be protected. It's the logic behind the drone, the checkpoint, the prison, the disappearing of boys, the stripping of fathers from their families, the overall violence that these men experience. But the Quran doesn't just name this logic, it refutes it. In Surah Ghafir, a believing man from Pharaoh's own household speaks out against the planned killing of Musa alayhi salam. His monologue is one of the longest in the Quran, and it exposes the arrogance of tyrannical power. He says, "Those who dispute the signs of Allah without any authority having come to them. This is greatly hateful to Allah and the believers. This is how Allah seals the heart of every arrogant Jabbar." This man wasn't a prophet, but he recognized Pharaoh's logic for what it was. Violence used to defend a socio-political order narrated in religious language, built on the enslavement and persecution of the children of Israel. It's the same logic we see today, where resistance is criminalized, truth is labeled as sedition, and Palestinian lives are treated as threats. He saw it, he named it, he stood up. So, this logic of El Jabarut is what I've been tracing out for a decade. But within that same decade, something else was emerging after the post Gamergate era. I noticed a familiar shift. The early signs of a crisis of masculinity. It's echoed throughout history, but this time it was taking on new forms, spreading through new channels of influence. The manosphere was taking shape, and Muslim influencers, religious leaders, intellectuals, they weren't just watching, they were echoing it, amplifying it, adopting its logic. Then a moment that crystallized it all. A podcast clip. It was just a short conversation between Muslim men and it went viral for what I would say all the wrong reasons. At first glance, it looked like typical chaotic background noise of discourse. But if you sit with what was said and how people responded, you'll see it cracked something wide open in how we talk about masculinity and Qawwamah. It might look like chaos, but it's a pattern. And this clip, it makes the historical repetition impossible to ignore. It opened up a contradiction we've been carrying for years. No one wants to name this contradiction, but here's the question driving this whole video. Does our conception of masculinity lead to or justify the oppression of Palestinian men? We're going to look at the crisis of masculinity and Qawwamah, and the way Tafsir has been shaped by historical assumptions, and how much of what we call manhood today has been inherited not from revelation, but from empire. Because this isn't just about gender or masculinity. It's about how power dresses itself in divine language, and how we risk becoming its messengers unless we step back and ask, whose masculinity are we defending, and at what cost? Introducing the controversial podcast clip. Let me break down the clip that I saw. It's typical podcast bro material, but it generated enough backlash that the creators ended up deleting it from their TikTok. But I've been paying attention not just to what was said, but how people responded. And here's what stood out. Most people weren't actually listening. They got stuck on the image of a woman paying 100% of the bills. That's what triggered the outrage. That image, not the underlying argument, was what caused controversy. But what the guests actually said, it ruptured over 20 years of discourse on Muslim masculinity. Because in trying to defend masculinity or manhood or Qawwamah, they exposed the cracks and contradictions in the foundation of how we think about masculinity. Here's the clip.
Irrespective of her even paying 100%, the man is still the leader. The man still leads the household, and the decision making is with the man.
But that wouldn't make sense. If a woman is paying 100% of the bills, she might as well be the man.
No, she isn't the man. She doesn't become the man. Is finance the only determining factor to be a man? Huh? Is that the only determining factor to be a man? Are you based on just money? Is that what you are?
الرجال قوامون على النساء بما فضل الله به بعضهم على بعض وبما أنفقوا من أموالهم.
Now translate for me, Ikhwa.
الرجال قوامون, that men are responsible over women because of the بما فضل الله به بعضهم على بعض, which is the favors that he gave. Wait a minute.
Habibi.
وبما أنفقوا من أموالهم, which relates to the man.
That's unrelated to the point we're talking
about. It is
about.
related to the man. Because وبما أنفقوا من أموالهم is what the man is providing for the woman. It's not what the woman is providing for the man.
That one moment did something no one realized. It revealed a contradiction that's been sitting in our discourse for years. If male leadership is tied to provision, what happens when provision flips? Does that leadership disappear? Does our theology change? The guest argues that even if a woman covers 100% of the household expenses, the man is still the head of the household. Then the host, his friend, pushes back. He asks, so is the woman the man now? Then he brings up the Qur'an, the verse from Surah An-Nisa, where he links Qawwamah and Fadl directly to providing financially. The wild part is that neither of them, nor most people reacting to the clip, seem to realize what just happened, because that exchange didn't just spark a debate typical to social media. It quietly unraveled 2 decades of Muslim masculinity discourse. It wasn't about theology. It was about discomfort with the idea of a woman providing everything. That image, a woman covering all of the expenses, felt like a reversal of divine order, something we associate with Western liberalism. So the host pushed back, not because he wanted to debate spending, but because the idea of a woman providing just rubs us the wrong way, so much so that we feel the need to oppose it at all costs. So when he cited the verse from Surah An-Nisa to reassert that men are supposed to provide, he thought he was reinforcing the Islamic view on masculinity. But what he actually did without realizing it was reveal how fragile the whole framework really is. Because if your sense of manhood collapses the moment a woman pays the bills, then what is it really about? And that's where this conversation really begins. Because what this moment reveals, and what we're going to explore in this video, is how masculinity is being interpreted, defended, and destabilized today. And more importantly, how much of what we call Islamic masculinity isn't actually rooted in the Qur'an. It's coming from somewhere else. From colonial logic, Western hierarchies, state-embedded power structures we've absorbed without realizing it. So instead of just saying, what does the Tafsir say, we need to flip the question and ask, what historical forces are shaping how we read this verse? What assumptions, ideologies, and frameworks are already in our heads before we even open the Quran? And how do those shape the Tafsir we quote and the parts we leave out? That's what we're here to talk about in this video. Part 1. Manhood on Trial, the question that unraveled 20 years of discourse. What that guy in the clip is really asking is something a lot of men are afraid to say out loud. Am I only a man if I make money? And that question, it shakes the foundation of 2 decades of Muslim discourse on masculinity. For 20 years, we've been told the same thing on repeat. Qawwamah isn't just about what men do. It's about who men are. Masculinity, we're told, is essential, fixed, divine. You are a leader by nature. You are built to provide. That's what makes you a Qawwam. But here's the part nobody wants to admit. Every interpretation we offer is shaped by the assumptions we carry. And those assumptions, they don't come from nowhere. They come from history, from lived experience, from ideology, from colonial categories of sex, power, and hierarchy. The same ones that still shape how we think, even when we believe we're just doing, quote, tafsir. So when someone opens the Quran today and reads a verse about men and leadership, we have to ask, what assumptions are already baked into our worldview and theirs? What's already been planted in our heads before we even approach the text? Now, I'm not asking this to claim that others are ideological while I am soundly objective. That's not the purpose of this question. Let me give you an example as to why I'm asking this question. Imagine waking up on a moving train. You don't know how you got there. You look around and start asking questions. You know Allah is the creator of the train as well as the conductor, and that the destination, death, is inevitable. So you have to learn the train you're on, its people, its cargo, its architecture, how it's built, how it moves, what it demands of you. Because all of that shapes how you use your energy, yourself, your time, so that you don't waste this journey towards an inescapable end. That's what it's like to be born into this world. You have to study the train you're already riding. But we rarely ask, what's outside the train? The land we're speeding through, the other trains running parallel to our train, and the ones we can't even see. There are people on entirely different tracks, in different places and historical moments, each shaped by different forces, different architecture, different destinations. And if we never look beyond our own train, we start to mistake our journey for the universal one. We are born on a neocolonial train. Others were born on different versions of it, with different histories, different luxuries, different ruins. So the real question is, are we brave enough to ask if our lens, the ones shaping how we read the Quran, and how we interpret gender, and how we define leadership, is colonized? That's why we need to pause here and talk about tafsir versus tadabbur. Tafsir sets the boundaries. It draws on language, grammar, context, the occasion of revelation, its position in the surah, and how it's related to other verses. Sometimes a verse is even in conversation with the other scriptures and stories of other communities. Tafsir essentially tells us what can't be said about the verse. Tadabbur, on the other hand, is a reflection where we emotionally, spiritually, and intellectually engage within those boundaries. A historian might focus on the socio-political context. A Sufi might emphasize purification of the heart. Others might cross-reference related verses for thematic consistency. But If we never question the train we're on, we'll never realize how that train shapes our reflections. And if our worldview is already shaped by empire, hierarchy, colonial logic, then even sincere tadabbur can go off course or distort the meaning of the text. Because it's not that tadabbur is invalid, it just needs to be realigned with the proper boundaries through rigorous tafsir, specifically tafsir of the Qur'an with the Qur'an. Because tadabbur can let in unsubstantiated ideas from outside the text, cultural ones, political ones, psychological ones. And today, many of our ideas about masculinity are shaped by a neo-colonial worldview, one that presumes a racialized imperial version of manhood, a vision that glorifies control, dominance, and provision, then repackages those traits as fitrah, as if they were natural or divinely ordained. So if someone believes masculinity only exists in binary opposition to women, if they believe financial control automatically determines who leads, then that belief will shape both their tadabbur and how they receive tafsir, because the way you feel about masculinity is shaped by the train you're on. Let's go back to that podcast. The host was reacting to the image of a woman providing 100%. Something we as a community often associate with Western liberal feminism. To him, Islam means men provide. That's the natural order ordained by Allah. Meanwhile, the guest was trying to argue that manhood has an essence apart from income. But what these guys ended up doing unintentionally was unraveling the very structure of masculinity we've been creating over the years. Because if masculinity is biological, then why does its significance collapse the moment a woman earns more? But here are some additional questions for you to think about. To the sisters, when a man says, "I'm the leader no matter what does that actually reveal? What does it say about how he interprets the Quran and what he expects from you? Because a man's understanding of leadership isn't just a belief. It's a forecast of his behavior. So when life tests him, when power shifts, when money disappears, you won't be living in theology or theoreticals. You'll be living in the consequences." To the brothers, before you jump to defend Islam, masculinity, or Qawwamah, pause, take a breath, and let's just enjoy how cool this game looks. So in this part of the game, I was running around trying to find people to talk to develop the story, to learn about what's going on in the game. Because at the end of the harbor, there's some sort of impending doom. So I was trying to figure out more to the story and more to the context of the game. But honestly, okay, just ask yourself this question. What assumptions are you bringing into your reading of the text? We're all born on different trains, some similar, some radically different, but being born on a specific train shapes how we see, think, feel, and reflect. So what ideas about being a real man have you inherited? And why do they feel true? Because the question isn't just, do you believe in the Quran? It's, what story are you telling yourself about your relationship to the Quran? And what role does that story play in how you see yourself as a man? Because all it took was one question. What if a woman provides 100%? To show the fragility of all of our assumptions about masculinity. What if the ideas we defend as fitrah were actually written by empire? What if the versions of masculinity we inherited, the ones dressed in dominance or disguised as divine, was rooted in a racial fantasy about who gets to rule? And because we are historical beings, our perception of the past is never neutral. It's shaped by public memory, emotion, trauma, education, the time we live in. That's why we need to talk about Tarzan. Because if our theology around Qawwamah is influenced by empire, we need to examine the stories empire used to justify male leadership. And one of the most enduring stories is Tarzan. We're going to examine both the memory of Tarzan, the cartoon many of us grew up watching, and the colonial roots of the original novel. because the gap between them tells us something very important. This isn't just about a cartoon, it's about a colonial blueprint, a myth that told the world some men are born to lead, not by merit, but by nature, by essence, by biology. And in that myth, we, men of color, Muslim men, brown men, black men, were never the men with that essence. So in part 2, we're going to unpack the political theology of Tarzan, how colonialism gave masculinity a face, a race, a destiny, and how that same fantasy still lingers in the way we reflect on Qawwamah today, shaping our understanding of manhood through a misremembered past. Part 2. The political theology of Tarzan. How colonial fantasies shaped the myth of the natural male leader. One of my favorite pastimes as a historian is problematizing things people love, because why the hell not? So today I'm going to ruin a scene from Tarzan, featuring everyone's favorite song.
Whatever you do, I'll do it too. Show me everything, tell me how. You don't need something, and yet nothing to me. Oh, I can see there's so much to learn. It's all so close, and yet so far. I see myself as people see me. Oh, I just know there's something bigger out there. I wanna know, can you show me? I wanna know about the strangers like me. Tell me more, please show me. Something's familiar about the strangers like me.
In the animated film, Tarzan expresses curiosity. He learns who his people were, what civilization is, about art, music, astronomy, all kinds of things, learning about the strangers like him. It's framed as a tender moment of connection, a man raised in the jungle, who is different his whole life, finally learning where he belongs. He was born outside of the train. But if you trace it back to the original novel, by Edgar Rice Burroughs, it's not innocent, it's racial supremacy. Let's talk about what that Tarzan scene did in the past. The novel contrasts Tarzan with Turkaz, a violent, chaotic ape who functions both literally and metaphorically as a stand-in for black men, meant to show what happens when the wrong kind of masculinity takes power.
From the time Tarzan left the tribe of great anthropoids in which he had been raised, it was torn by continual strife and discord. Turkaz proved a cruel and capricious king, so that, one by one, many of the older and weaker apes took their families and sought the quiet and safety of the far interior.
So after Tarzan leaves, leadership of the apes falls on Turkaz, a tyrant who rules through brute violence, not wisdom or stability. His cruelty causes unrest and division, forcing many of the tribe's older and more vulnerable members to flee. Eventually, those apes reach a breaking point.
Those who remained were driven to desperation. One of them recalled the parting warning of Tarzan. If you have a chief who is cruel, let 2 or 3 or 4 of you attack him together. And the ape who recalled this wise counsel repeated it, so that when Turkaz returned, he found a warm reception awaiting him.
This is not just a rebellion, it's the strategic collective revolt, directly inspired by Tarzan's earlier counsel. Even in absence, Tarzan remains the tribe's source of order, planning, and resistance. He represents a civilizing force, a mind superior to brute dominance. Exposed and outnumbered, Turkaz flees.
At heart he was an errant coward, so he did not remain to fight and die, but tore himself away, and fled into the sheltering boughs of the forest. For several days he wandered aimlessly, nursing his spite and looking for some weak thing on which to vent his pent anger.
Stripped of power, Turkaz doesn't reflect. He doesn't change. He becomes a loose, dangerous force wandering through the jungle filled with resentment, rage, and a thirst to reassert dominance. Eventually, he finds a target.
He was right above them when he discovered them. The first intimation Jane Porter had was when the great hairy body dropped to the earth beside her. One piercing scream escaped her lips as the brute hand clutched her arm. Then she was dragged toward those awful fangs which yawned at her throat. But ere they touched that fair skin, another mood claimed the anthropoid. The tribe had kept his women. He must find others to replace them. This hairless white ape would be the first of his new household.
The scene escalates into one of racialized sexual threat. At first, Turquoise seemed poised to kill Jane, a gesture of pure violence, but the narrative quickly reframes it. He now sees Jane not as prey, but as property. His language shifts to that of forced sexual possession. She will become the first of his new household, and the novel makes sure we know she's fully aware.
But Jane did not once lose consciousness. Her brain was clear, and she comprehended all that transpired.
Unlike Esmeralda, who faints, Jane is written as fully conscious. She knows exactly what is happening to her, making the horror even more visceral. She is not only victimized, but made to witness and endure it in full awareness. What we see in Turquoise is the archetype of racialized masculinity as imagined by colonial fantasy. Desire without discipline, power without restraint, rage without rationality. One that sees women as objects of sexual gratification and breeding. His failure to lead becomes a moral indictment, not just of his actions, but of his being, his essence. He is not simply a bad leader. He is unfit to lead. He cannot evolve. He cannot reflect. He cannot love. He only conquers, and that conquest is always irrational violence. And yet Tarzan was raised in the same jungle, the same lawless world, exposed to the same violence, the same instincts, the same rawness. But the novel insists he is not like the apes, by essence.
A perfect type of the strongly masculine, unmarred by dissipation, or brutal or degrading passions. For, though Tarzan of the Apes was a killer of men and of beasts, he killed as the hunter kills, dispassionately. Except on those rare occasions when he had killed for hate, though not the brooding, malevolent hate, which marks the features of its own with hideous lines. But to account for the strange likeness between Lord Greystoke and this forest god, that was quite beyond her. And it is not strange that she could not imagine that this naked savage was indeed an English nobleman. It was a stately and gallant little compliment performed with the grace and dignity of utter unconsciousness of self. It was the hallmark of his aristocratic birth, the natural outcropping of many generations of fine breeding. An hereditary instinct of graciousness which a lifetime of uncouth and savage training and environment could not eradicate. It was growing dark now, and so they ate again of the fruit which was both food and drink for them. Then Tarzan rose, and leading Jane to the little bower he had erected, motioned her to go within. For the first time in hours a feeling of fear swept over her. And Tarzan felt her draw away as though shrinking from him. Contact with this girl for half a day had left a very different Tarzan from the one on whom the morning sun had risen. Now, in every fiber of his being, heredity spoke louder than training. He had not in one swift transition become a polished gentleman from a savage ape-man. But at last the instincts of the former predominated. And over all was the desire to please the woman he loved, and to appear well in her eyes. So Tarzan of the Apes did the only thing he knew to assure Jane of her safety. He removed his hunting knife from its sheath and handed it to her hilt first, again motioning her into the bower.
So the author is clear. Tarzan's civility isn't the product of transformation. It's the reemergence of his racial essence. Somewhere deep in his genetic material, Tarzan carries the dormant instincts of Anglo-Saxon civility. Even though he was raised in the wild, he was able to restrain himself, not because he was taught to, but because his white male body inherently possesses civilization. It's not something he learns. It's not something he awakens to. And this wasn't just fiction. It was framed as science. In Manliness and Civilization, Gail Betterman shows how white male self-restraint, especially sexual restraint, became the ultimate marker of civilization. The logic went like this. All men feel desire, but white men, particularly Anglo-Saxon men, were uniquely capable of suppressing it, unlike black men or colonized savages. They had the moral and biological discipline to govern their instincts. That restraint wasn't just virtue, it was political evidence used to justify who gets to rule and who gets to be free and who must be controlled. In the book, In the Biopolitics of Feelings, Kayla Schuler explains how 19th century race sciences constructed whiteness, especially white manhood, as uniquely impressible. White male bodies, they believed, were biologically capable of refinement. By contrast, black and indigenous bodies were imagined as fixed, ruled by instinct, emotionally dull, and incapable of elevation. So when Tarzan unlearns the ways of savagery, the novel doesn't frame it as a transformation. It's framed as inevitable, not a miracle, but a birthright. He doesn't just possess a superior essence. His very body is capable of absorbing and radiating civilization. That's the colonial fantasy. So when Tarzan learns science, when he builds and speaks, it's destiny. His training comes from the jungle, but his entire being, that comes from whiteness, from race, from the natural genius encoded in his body. So going back to that animated scene we're familiar with, Tarzan isn't just learning how to speak. He's absorbing math, astronomy, history, architecture, all the disciplines that supposedly define civilization. And the soundtrack swells with Phil Collins singing about the strangers like me. But what's happening in this montage isn't curiosity, it's confirmation. Confirmation that this white man, even without schooling or human contact, is already built for science, power, order, because it's in his flesh. He was never becoming civilized, he always was. And that's not just a Disney story, it's the blueprint for modern masculinity. So Tarzan unlearning savagery doesn't mean much. He doesn't just have the superior essence, he has the right kind of body, one that race science believes could absorb civilization and radiate mastery. That's why his ability to learn language, adopt manners, or express restraint isn't treated as surprising. It's biopolitical destiny, the racial fantasy that some men are biologically built to evolve, while others are biologically locked in place. That's the colonial fantasy, that white men are born to rule, and others are born to be ruled. And here's where it hits home. When Muslim men today argue that even if a woman earns 100%, the man is still the leader because he's built for it, we have to stop and ask, built how? By what logic? According to what model of manhood? Because if we trace that logic, it leads straight back to the same colonial blueprint that built Tarzan, wrote race science, justified global domination. It's not just Fitrah, it's Jabarūt in the flesh, dressed up in divine language, but running on the logic of empire, naturalized by the sciences. This colonial system didn't just dominate lands, it redefined masculinity itself. And within that framework, the Muslim man was never imagined as a true masculine man, only as a failed version of one. Quote, the subjugation of the Muslim male was thus in his production in the register of masculinity as a failed specimen. If the evolution of Western man was confirmed in his superiority over savage male life forms, the inferiority of the Muslim male lay in his perpetual inability to rise to the former's exalted status. The Muslim male thus symbolized a savage Islamic manliness within the phallocentrism of the West. End quote. So when we cling to traits that we associate with masculinity, like dominance, provision, hierarchy, as signs of divinely ordained leadership dictated by Islam, proven by natural sciences, Are we truly following the Quran, or are we chasing a racialized fantasy we were never meant to fulfill? That's the myth at the heart of Tarzan. The savage ape, like Turkaz, is unfit for leadership, not just because he's violent, but because he lacks control. Humiliation doesn't humble him, it enrages him. And his answers to rejection isn't reflection, it's aggression. He doesn't earn loyalty, he seizes women, not for love, not for intimacy, but for breeding and for ownership, to reassert his power. And Tarzan, he was raised in the same jungle, in the same lawless world, exposed to the same violence, instincts, and cues. But the novel insists he's not like the apes, because deep in his blood, deeper than his upbringing, deeper than his behavior, lies the dormant code of Anglo-Saxon restraint. He doesn't hold back because of morality, or revelation, or even love. He restrains himself because of race. Quote, now, in every fiber of his being, hereditary spoke louder than training. End quote. From that moment forward, Tarzan's entire motivation shifts. Not to dominate, not to conquer, but to be worthy in Jane's eyes. Quote, and overall was the desire to please the woman he loved, to appear well in her eyes. End quote. That's the racial fantasy. White men don't need to be taught virtue. They inherit it. Even when Tarzan kills, it's never framed as irrational or savage. Quote, he killed as the hunter kills, dispassionately. End quote. His violence is measured, his instinct restrained, not because he learned morality, but because his body is already coded for civility. White male violence is never condemned. It's rational, justified, holy. And that's the legacy embedded in today's masculinist theology. The idea that a man's power, even his aggression, is righteous, so long as it's controlled. But in that framework, domination becomes sanctified, and masculinity becomes less about ethics and more about aesthetic restraint. Not whether a man is violent, but how gracefully he performs it. Part 3. Empire's favorite monster. Why the West had to invent the savage man to make its violence holy and civil. In 1901, at a symposium called the Race Problem of the South, Dr. George T. Winston, a university president in North Carolina, gave a speech about what he called the real problem. It wasn't poverty, it wasn't injustice, it wasn't even the Klan, it was the black brute. He claimed that before emancipation, white women could sleep peacefully with black men guarding their homes. But now, he said, they shudder in horror, because a monstrous beast crazed with lust is at the door. Then he justified lynching, described it like a ritual, the stake, the oil, the crowds of thousands. He made it sound necessary, civilized, restorative, rational. But here's what we need to understand. Winston wasn't a rogue extremist. He was a university president. And that university, the North Carolina College of Agriculture and Mechanic Arts, was built on stolen land from indigenous nations under the Morrill Land Grant Act. Stolen land, producing the latest research in humanities and military training. All of it was used to frame black men as inherently violent and utilize the technologies produced to enact that violence. This was empire through and through. Quote, mulattoes are quicker and more refined. Pure black men, savage, lustful, demonical. End quote. This wasn't just racism. It was scientific racial theory, a political theology of masculinity. It said, we are the only ones fit to rule, because our violence is noble. Theirs, demonic. This isn't just about Jim Crow. It's not just a Southern thing. This is a global script. We need to stop seeing the marginalization of Muslim, black, and indigenous masculinities as isolated incidents. They're not separate tragedies. They're variations of the same design, the same blueprint, the same script. The same structure that made the black man in Winston's speech a monster is what turns Palestinians into future insurgents. It's what casts Muslim refugee fathers as a threat to European values. It's what makes even tenderness from racialized men seem dangerous. Their love isn't allowed to exist without suspicion. Their protection is always read as potential violence. Their bodies are framed as too emotional, too volatile, too irrational, too feminine, unless they're submissive or self-sacrificing. That logic didn't die. It traveled, it adapted, it became common sense. We need to understand what kind of ideas are being narrated throughout history about masculinities. So let's listen to Winston's full speech, not because we need to be shocked or have moral outrage, but because we need to understand how does empire builds its monsters and understands itself and its masculinity. As you hear these words, don't just focus on the grotesque imagery. Listen to how he builds his argument. Pay attention to how he frames black men, how he reveres whiteness, how he makes violence seem rational, and how he produces history that still echoes today.
The one great evil connected with race familiarity, the evil of licentiousness and miscegenation, while degrading to the white race, was not entirely harmful to the Negro. Nearly all the leaders of the Negro race, both during slavery and since, have been mulattoes, and the two really great men credited to the Negro race in the United States have been the sons of white fathers and strongly marked by the mental and moral qualities of the white race. The mulatto is quicker, brighter, and more easily refined than the Negro. There is a general opinion among Southern people that he is inferior morally, but I believe that his only inferiority is physical and vital. It cannot be denied that the Negro race has been very greatly elevated by its mulatto members. Indeed, if you strike from its records all that mulattoes have said and done, little would be left. Wherever work requiring refinement, extra intelligence, and executive ability is performed, you will find it usually directed by mulattoes. The social intercourse between the races in the South, which was so helpful to the blacks, has now practically ceased. The children of this generation no longer play and frolic together. White ladies no longer visit Negro cabins. The familiar salutation of uncle or auntie is no longer heard. The lady's maid sleeps no more beside her mistress. The Southern woman, with her helpless little children in a solitary farmhouse, no longer sleeps secure in the absence of her husband, with doors unlocked but safely guarded by black men whose lives would be freely given in her defense. But now, when a knock is heard at the door, she shudders with nameless horror. The black brute is lurking in the dark, a monstrous beast, crazed with lust. His ferocity is almost demoniacal. A mad bull or a tiger could scarcely be more brutal. A whole community is now frenzied with horror, with blind and furious rage for vengeance. A stake is driven, the wretched brute, covered with oil, bruised and gashed, beaten and hacked and maimed, amid the jeers and shouts and curses, the tears of anger and of joy, the prayers and the maledictions of thousands of civilized people in the sight of schoolhouses, courthouses, and churches, is burned to death. Since the abolition of slavery and the growing up of a new generation of Negroes, crimes that are too hideous to describe have been committed every month, every week, frequently every day, against the helpless women and children of the white race, crimes that were unknown in slavery. And in turn, cruelties have been inflicted upon Negroes by whole communities of whites which, if attempted during slavery, would have been prevented at any sacrifice. I do not hesitate to say that more horrible crimes have been committed by the generation of Negroes that have grown up in the South since slavery than by the 6 preceding generations in slavery. And also that the worst cruelties of slavery, all combined for 2 centuries, were not equal to the savage barbarities inflicted in retaliation upon the Negroes by the whites during the last 20 years.
So he's narrating the breakdown of civilized society, and the performance of that violence is inherently civilized. Winston wasn't just describing a threat. He was instructing his audience on how to see one. He taught them to view violence as sacred, to frame white violence as protective, and black existence as a threat. He romanticized the past, yearning for slavery not as a tragedy, but as a moral good to society. He painted the image of a fearful white woman, vulnerable and alone, to rouse white men to anger, to make them feel righteous in their vengeance, to justify lynching, to make racial mob violence feel like a duty, not terror. All the while, he refused to acknowledge the real machinery of violence, the systemic ongoing brutality of whiteness itself. That's the same script used today to explain away drone strikes, to rationalize settler violence, to dehumanize the colonized. It's in the same way Muslim men are framed as hypersexual or emotionally volatile. It's in the same way Palestinian boys are cast as future insurgents. It's in the way even the gentlest acts of resistance by racialized men are read as threats to the moral order. And what Winston called science felt like common sense. That's the real danger. The goal here isn't just to critique the past. We've been riding one train so long, we started mistaking it for the whole railway system. But to see clearly, we have to zoom out, because empire laid these tracks, and we're not the only passengers. The story about who's rational, who's emotional, who's dangerous, who's divine, it keeps playing on a loop. Different actors, but the same script. And it's time we start rewriting it. Let me show you how deep this logic runs. Even color wasn't neutral. Sexologists like Havelock Ellis argue that primitive races responded more intensely to red, the warm emotional side of the color spectrum, while the civilized races, i.e. white men, were more attuned to the blue and violent, the calm and rational side. Children responded to red, but so did colonized men. According to Ellis, that made both children and men of color emotionally immature, biologically incapable of rationality or restraint. He never had to say black men were childlike. The implication was already coded. This is what Kayla Schuler is talking about in her book Biopolitics of Feelings. White male bodies were imagined as impressible, biologically able to absorb sentiment and become civilized. Black and indigenous bodies were unimpressible, stuck in instinct. Having specific attachments to certain emotions became a sign of superiority evident by the biological sciences, and only white men passed. That's why Winston's lynching logic didn't feel like horror to his audience. They didn't think they were burning someone alive. They thought they were defending civilization. This is what made George Winston's lynching logic feel reasonable to his audience. It felt reasonable. It felt rational. It felt true. It felt like justice. It's affective. He wasn't describing a breakdown of civilization. He was performing it, justifying it, saying our violence is civil, theirs is savage. And just like that, brutality becomes civility, masculinity becomes a script for empire. And this infantilization wasn't just imposed on non-white men. It was also directed towards women, even white women. Civilizationalists believe women sat evolutionarily halfway between white men and non-white people. Take this quote from Edward Drinker Coops, The Relation of the Sexes to the Government. Quote, "Woman is not only restrained by her reproductive functions, but she inherits a greater disability from thousands of ages. Even when white women display traits that challenge men's superiority, they remain inferior in their sex qualities of mind." End quote. He argues that women of higher race may seem superior to men of lower races or some of their peers, but even then, white women are biologically marked by mental limitations because she inherited such deficiency by evolution, because she's burdened with reproduction. This pseudoscience framed both women and non-white people as unfit for autonomy. White men alone were seen as equipped to lead, not because of character, but because of biology. That's how patriarchy and white supremacy were built to reinforce each other, through selective logic, through weaponized science, through false nature. Because that same framework that equates restraint with whiteness, dominance with manhood, and impulse with racial failure, hasn't gone anywhere. It's in how the West sees Muslim men. It's how the state sees Palestinian boys. And it's in how some of us as Muslim men start seeing ourselves. When we cling to certain traits like dominance, control, provision as signs of leadership, when we insist we are leaders no matter what, when we demand obedience as proof of piety, we're not resisting empire, we're just reenacting it. We're just using new language. This is not the masculinity of the Prophet ﷺ. It's the masculinity of Winston, of Roosevelt, of Tarzan. And unless we start recognizing it, we'll keep reproducing it and calling it divine. So why are we calling it Islamic? And unless we start recognizing that fact, we'll keep reproducing it and calling it divine order, made natural by Allah. Part 4, From Brute to Terrorist, How Empire Globalized the Savage Threat as an Alibi to Redeem the Humiliated West. The black brute didn't disappear. He got exported. The same racial myth that justified lynching in the American South, the image of the hypersexual, uncontrollable, violent black man, was reborn in Americans' foreign policy towards Palestine because the logic never changed. It just found a new stage. By the 1970s, white evangelicals in America believed they were under siege. The world they thought God has ordained for them was falling apart. The nuclear family was crumbling. Desegregation was invading neighborhoods. Women were demanding autonomy. And the Vietnam War, it shattered the illusion of American dominance. But this wasn't just about politics. It was about masculinity. The West felt humiliated, and it needed redemption. That redemption came in the form of political theology, a new gospel of manhood, wrapped in scripture, backed by the state, and designed to restore order in the bedroom, the home, the nation, and the world. And that's where Jerry Falwell comes in. A Southern Baptist pastor and televangelist, Falwell rose to prominence in the 1970s and 80s as the founder of the Moral Majority, a political movement that mobilized conservative Christians into a powerful voting bloc. But Falwell wasn't just preaching theology, he was engineering a political vision, one that fused white patriarchal order with Cold War conservatism, masking it as divine will. He became one of the key public faces of the masculine restoration campaign. He defended segregation under the guise of religious liberty. He framed civil rights as government overreach. And most critically, he repackaged the racial hierarchy into a new theological doctrine, complementarianism. Men would lead, women would submit, children will obey, and anyone, black communities, feminists, anti-war activists, who challenged that order was cast as an enemy of civilization and its rightful masculine defenders. Falwell didn't just imply that, he said it explicitly. Reacting to the Brown v. Board of Education ruling, he wrote,
"We have left God out of decisions altogether. If Chief Justice Warren and his associates had known God's word and had desired to do the Lord's will, I am quite confident that the 1954 decision, in Brown v. Board of Education, would never have been made. If we persist in tearing down God's barriers, God must punish us for it. The theory of communism is social equality, but there is no such thing. Souls are of equal value and importance, but that is as far as we can go. Who then is propagating this terrible thing? Finally, we see the devil himself behind it. What will integration of the races do to us? It will destroy our race eventually."
To Falwell, desegregation wasn't just a policy shift, it was a threat to God's order. And that belief laid the groundwork for anti-welfare politics that followed. I already broke this down in Is Poverty a Sin? Part 2 on TikTok. How racialized poverty was weaponized to frame black mothers as parasitic and black fathers as absent or criminal, turning public compassion into punishment. It was the same logic. Social equality is chaos, government care is rebellion, racial justice is satanic. But Falwell's war to restore order didn't stop at home. He turned outward and found in Zionism the perfect frontier. Quote,
I feel that the destiny of the State of Israel is without question the most crucial international matter facing the world today. I believe that the people of Israel have not only a theological but also a historical and legal right to the land. I have arrived at the conclusion that unless the United States maintains its unswerving devotion to the State of Israel, the very survival of that nation is at stake. Every American who agrees Israel has the right to the land must be willing to exert all possible pressure on the powers that be to guarantee America's support of the State of Israel at this time.
To Falwell and his allies, Israel was the final outpost of Western values, God's last stronghold in a world unraveling, and Palestinian resistance, that wasn't just politics, it was theological rebellion. It was the black brute logic, dressed in the kafiyah. Palestinian men became the new symbol of racialized masculinity gone rogue, and the Israeli soldier, he became the model man, rational, restrained, righteous in violence. Western masculinity reborn in Hebrew armor. That's why they had no problem gutting welfare at home, even when it harmed poor white families, while sending billions abroad to support a foreign military regime, because the goal was never care, it was always about control. Whether domestic or foreign, the logic stayed the same. Restore divine order, preserve patriarchal hierarchy, crush resistance, whether it came from black mothers or Palestinian fathers. And crushing resistance, whether it was from black mothers or Palestinian fathers, wasn't just a spiritual vision. It needed an engine, a state, a strategy. Here comes Ronald Reagan. He didn't invent this worldview. He institutionalized it. He took Falwell's gospel of patriarchal control and turned it into law, into bombs, into prisons. At home, he gave us the welfare queen and the super predator. Abroad, he baptized endless war in the name of democracy, all to protect a fragile, racialized white manhood that demanded obedience at home and overseas. The message was clear. White manhood is under siege, under crisis. The threat? Racialized masculinity. The solution? Militarized masculinity. So the black brute of the Jim Crow became the Palestinian terrorist of U.S. foreign policy. The same archetype, same logic, just a new setting. Because both were cast as threats to white purity, accused of corrupting Western innocence, used to justify preemptive and righteous violence, essential to restoring a humiliated but holy Western masculinity. And it all came cloaked in complementarianism. Zionism wasn't just a geopolitical move. It was a masculine redemption arc. Movies like Cast a Giant Shadow, produced by John Wayne's own company, made this clear. Israel was in distress. America is the savior. Mickey Marcus wasn't just fighting for Israel. He was resurrecting American masculinity after Vietnam's shame. The settler fantasy was reborn. Zionism became manhood's second chance, and Palestinian men, they became the villain the script required. This is why global power and the gospel of patriarchy go hand in hand. Evangelical patriarchy doesn't just normalize violence, it sanctifies it as necessary for social and moral order. What starts as male headship at homes turns into empire abroad. This isn't just theology, it's ritual violence sponsored by the state. So when we look at Gaza today, we can't say this is shocking. It's not. It's the moral performance of Western manhood. It's the lynching of the 1900s. And instead of torches, they're using missiles. It's the same logic. They're savage, ungovernable, dangerous. Civilization must defend itself. And when the smoke clears, evangelicals do not blame empire. They do not blame Zionism. They do not blame white supremacy. They blame the people who challenge what they believed is the divine order. Falwell said this after 9/11.
I really believe that the pagans, and the abortionists, and the feminists, and the gays, and the lesbians who are actively trying to make that an alternative lifestyle, the ACLU. People for the American way, all of them who have tried to secularize America. I point the finger in their face and say, you helped this happen.
That's the world I was born into. A world where manhood meant white dominance, where violence was the liturgy, and theology, it was just this script for control. But this empire didn't just rule with weapons, it ruled through ideas. It taught us that white men were born to lead, that restraint was racial, that masculinity is white dominance due to the inherent discipline in their bodies. Because of that, white men were given the divine right to commit any violence as necessary. It gave us Tarzan, it gave us Reagan, it gave us Falwell's Zionism, and now it's giving us naturalist Qawwamah, or Fitrah of masculinity. Part 5. Natural by Design. How Empire Made Masculinity a Theology of Fitrah. By now the pattern should be clear. Whether it's George Winston describing the black brute, Falwell calling integration a rebellion against God, Reagan turning black poverty into a threat while blessing Israeli militarism, it's the same logic running through all of it. Some men are born to protect. Others are born to be policed. Some violence gets framed as divine. Other violence gets treated as demonic. That logic doesn't just stay out there. It walks right into our own spaces. Quote a few verses of the Qur'an. Say the word fitrah, and suddenly it sounds like it belongs. So let's talk about how that happens. Alright. What do essentialists actually say? They will argue Qawwamah isn't just about money. It's natural. It's in your biology. Men, they claim, are built to lead. Leadership isn't earned. It's something embedded in your DNA. You'll hear lines like, it's not just about provision, it's about strength, responsibility, protectiveness, things women just don't have in the same way. They call it fitrah, they call it divine order, a fixed, God-given structure that supposedly mirrors how the natural world works. You see this logic spelled out in Muslim-authored articles in the post-9/11 era, like the one titled, In Defense of Male Headship in Islam. I'm not naming the writer here. That's not the point. I'm not in the business of going after individuals. I want us to understand the argument and think forward. In that piece, the author leans heavily on evolutionary biology and natural law to defend male authority. He says, well, just look at the animal kingdom. Males are more aggressive, more dominant, more likely to lead. Then he writes, Islamic teachings on male headship reflect the real differences between men and women. Men are more suited to leadership and responsibility, not because women are inferior, but because men and women are different by nature. End quote. He even points to incarceration stats, military service, and violent crime rates, as if all that proves male aggression isn't social or structural, but simply biological, that this is what it means to be male, fixed, innate, inevitable. But if violence is something society tolerates, and even rewards in certain contexts, doesn't it naturally proliferate? The West tolerates brutal violence against Palestinians every day. Is that violence natural too? So how can anyone claim some violence is rooted in biology, while other violence is shaped by politics, power, or policy? Doesn't it just depend on whose interests that violence protects and whose bodies it targets? Because if the legitimacy of violence is defined by its function within a hierarchy, then this argument isn't about biology. It's about power, and what kind of power we're willing to call natural. But before we even get into the prison argument, we have to pause, because there's a contradiction hiding right there in plain sight. Essentialists often say, Men and women are spiritually equal, but biologically different. But that doesn't mean one is superior. And at first, that sounds reasonable, maybe even respectful. But when you trace the history of that claim, the scaffolding underneath starts to show. This idea, different by nature, gained traction in the 1980s, especially within evangelical complementarian circles, because it became the politically correct way to argue that men should dominate in marriage and society without using the old school language of patriarchy. At its core, it reflects a desire to maintain male dominance while avoiding the social backlash that comes from open declarations of male superiority. In that sense, it functions as the gendered equivalent of a racial dog whistle, a coded way of saying what can no longer be said outright. And on paper, it sounds balanced. It sounds nice. But the foundation hasn't changed. It still draws from the same weaponized scientific roots that have long positioned women and anyone deemed softer as less capable. In fact, that idea of spiritual equality but structural differences mirrors the racial logic of the same era. Remember Jerry Falwell's response to desegregation? Quote, "The theory of social equality, but there is no such thing. Souls are of equal value and importance, but that is as far as we can go." End quote. He wasn't just rejecting integration. He was saying black people's souls might be equal, but society must remain unequal. Equality was spiritualized, but never actualized. And that rhetorical move, equality in the soul, but not in structure, became the blueprint for modern complementarianism. That's exactly what complementarianism does with gender. It says men and women are equal in worth, but not in function, not in authority, not in rights. So when someone says, "Men are more suited to leadership, not because women are inferior, but because they are different," people who say that, like Muslim leaders, are not actually rejecting Western hierarchy or white supremacy. They're just redressing it in gentler language. Because once you say, "Men are naturally more rational, more aggressive, more fit to lead, and women are naturally more emotional, passive, and nurturing," you're already ranking traits. And historically, that ranking has always placed men on top, specifically and especially white men. Remember what Edward Drinker Coop said in the relation of the sexes to the government? He argued that women are biologically inferior, so they shouldn't be given political rights, even white women. So no, saying this isn't about superiority doesn't change the foundation. You're just making it harder to detect, and it gets worse. Because this isn't just about masculinity in the abstract. It's not just, what is masculinity? What makes a man masculine? What are the traits of masculinity? Because this whole framework, especially in the United States, has always been tied to white patriarchal supremacy control, especially during times when people felt that control slipping. So from the 1970s to the 1990s, as mass incarceration exploded, evangelical complementarianists started connecting male headship to the need for social, moral, racial order. They saw society as falling apart, and they said the reason was simple. White men weren't leading. And they didn't mean all men. They don't mean you, brown Muslim man coming from Pakistan or wherever. They blamed the disorder on you, poor men, black men, immigrant men, brown men, Muslim men. In other words, inferior men who can never be masculine. Men who didn't and couldn't rule their homes properly. Men whose very presence was treated like a threat to civilization. In this worldview, white men weren't just protectors. They were divinely sanctioned enforcers whose violence was righteous. Their aggression isn't a flaw. It's a feature, a tool God gave them to discipline society, to discipline brown people, to restore order, and to hold the world together while everything is falling apart. And we've seen this pattern before. It wasn't just looking for new enemies. It was looking for new scripts, new men to frame as threats, and new soldiers to cast as saviors. It's the same myth that made Tarzan the rightful king of the jungle. Because even when he's raised amongst the apes, aka black people, brown people, men of color, his white Anglo-Saxon blood carries the instincts of leadership, the discipline of civilization, and the right to dominate that you don't have. You men of color do not have. I don't understand why you guys are so affiliated with this. Because his violence isn't portrayed as wild, it's righteous. When he enacts his violence against you, it's righteous. It's the same logic as George T. Winston in 1901, when he described the black brute as a threat that needed to be eliminated, lynching as a necessary act to restore civilized order. It's not savagery, it's moral correction. It's the same narrative Jerry Falwell deployed after Brown v. Board of Education, arguing that integration would destroy our race, and that white Christian men needed to reassert God's authority, first at home, then the nation, then globally. It's the same image Reagan painted, the stoic white enforcer restoring law and order, not just through prisons at home, but through wars abroad, from Gaza to Libya to Palestine. And it's the same logic that turned Zionism into a masculinity project, where the Israeli soldier became the new cowboy, the new GI, the new Tarzan, a symbol of controlled righteous violence in the desert of chaos. And Palestinians, they became the latest racialized, feminized, irrational threat. Vietnam was a turning point, a moment that American empire realized it could lose control. And to protect its fragile masculine ego, it found new battlegrounds in prisons, in schools, in drone strikes in the Middle East. And all of that violence, it wasn't framed as brutality. It was framed as balanced masculinity, as biological to men, as God's design for white Christian men. And to justify this vision, the same article that I quoted in defense of male headship continues to reassert the same logic as an Islamic principle, as something that Muslims should accept. This is what he says, quote, "But this is certainly not how God conveys sexual difference in Revelation, nor is it how God has ordered his creation. Manliness is a rather distinctive thing, related to forms of authority across the created world, and this is as true for the animal kingdom as it is for mankind. Males of varying species oversee their tribes and families, and are considerably more aggressive and more prone to conflict, and participate in the act of defending and attacking more readily than their female counterparts. Among humans, males likewise exhibit forms of assertiveness and aggression that are not shared by women. It should come as little surprise that men constitute the majority of the world's prison populations by a large margin, that they comprise the overwhelming majority of the world's military members, and that they are far more likely to be both victims and perpetrators of violent crimes. The common argument that attributes these disparities to the construction of social roles has been inadequate in explaining this phenomenon." End quote. So here is a popular Muslim opinion leader, writing in the post-9/11 era at a time where Muslim men are being profiled, surveillanced, and disappeared by the state, saying, well, look at the prison data, look at the crime data, look at military service data, look at the animals, look at the natural world. Men are naturally more aggressive. He's not just offering a theological reflection or a tadabbur. He's justifying the very logic that empowers the state to imprison Muslim men, to normalize militarism as a masculine ideal, to frame drone strikes as biologically inevitable. All of it is being disguised as Islamic, as Fitrah, as authentic Muslim masculinity. What he's really doing is echoing a century-old theology, one that baptized empire in divine language, sanctified violence as moral clarity, and crowned white masculinity as the rightful ruler of civilizations. So when Muslims echo that logic, when we cite the same crime stats, when we lean on the same scientific evolutionary theories, when we call this masculinity fitrah, we're not talking about Qur'an, we're not talking about Islam, we're reviving Falwell, we're echoing Reagan, we're reenacting Winston's theology of violence, we're imagining ourselves as Tarzan, just with a new accent and Arabic subtitles. Because the same al-Jabarūt logic that justifies lynching black men, that defends segregated schools, is the same logic launching missiles into Gaza right now. It's the same logic being used to define Qawwamah. It's the same logic embedded in the quiet claim Allah created men with this fitrah of masculinity. So we have to ask, what if the very masculinity we're defending in the name of Islam is the very masculinity being used to oppress Palestinian men? What if the traits we're calling divinely masculine, strength, dominance, control, are the same ones white colonial empire uses to erase them, to imprison them, to bomb them? And what if by defending this model, we're not protecting our religion, we're not protecting deen, we're preserving their very empire that subjugates us? That's the question we need to sit with before we build our theology on top of someone else's chains. Because if we're not careful, we won't be quoting just Tafsir. We'll be preserving the very power that maims, oppresses, kills, starves. Our brothers and sisters will cry over their bodies and then turn around and Islamicize the very Jabarūt that killed them in the first place. I know I can get worked up or angry or frustrated sometimes, right? But look at what I'm frustrated at. It's hard not to be. When severe harm and its logic are being normalized in our community, and it's being called religion, it's being called Islamic masculinity of fitrah, it's being called all these things, wouldn't you be upset? Especially, look at the logic. The logic causes harm to our ummah. Look, I'm not other people. I'm not coming to you selling you masculinity content for a hefty check. I'm not asking you for $350 an hour to coach you on how to be masculine. I'm not offering you a course. I'm not launching a brotherhood subscription. I'm not selling you an elite male club where you unlock the secrets of manhood if you pay enough to be initiated. I'm not selling you anything. I'm asking you to reflect, to ask, why does this logic feel so natural to us? Why does dominance feel like leadership? Why does feeling a lack of control justify harming others? Because we're all born on a neo-colonial train. And that train was already moving before we opened our eyes. It taught us what man means, how power is supposed to feel, who deserves to speak, who must be disciplined, and who doesn't get to say no. So now, when you feel like you're the one who sees things clearly, the one who knows what others don't, the one who's allowed to correct, to command, to control, you tell yourself it's because you're rational, you're objective, it's because you're a masculine man. You say, I was born with male private parts. Unlike women, I'm not ruled by emotions. I have a greater capacity to be masculine than other men. Oh, just look at, my muscles, my status, my wealth. I provide for my women. I think clearly. I dominate. That's what makes me a real man. But what if that's just what the train told you? What if that feeling that you're entitled to discipline others and it's righteous against your spouse, your kids, your sisters in Islam, the vulnerable people in our community that we see as weak, isn't proof of your moral clarity? It's proof of how deeply empire shaped your sense of self, right? That's the real question. Not how do we restore the Islamic order, but whose order are we trying to restore? Because I already know how some of you will respond. Sure, the West abuses masculinity, but that doesn't mean masculinity itself is wrong. It's natural. To that, ask yourself, who decides what counts as abuse? You say the West is corrupting or abusing masculinity. You're assuming there's a sacred, neutral version that's simply misused. To them, it's not misuse. They think they're inherently righteous. They believe because they're the real masculine men in this world, they ought to dominate, to lead, to subdue you, to subdue Palestinians. If we adopt the same logic, just swapping in Muslims for the men on top, are you really resisting al-Jabarūt? Are you resisting Pharaoh's system? Or are you just running the same logic and the same system with just a different skin color, a different language? Everything's just in Islamic tongues now, a Fitrah. Because if your foundation is the belief that whoever holds power is automatically more rational, more objective, more righteous, then you've already accepted the logic of empire. You're not challenging the train. You're just mad you weren't chosen to sit in the front car. And when Islamic manhood was narrated in the post 9/11 era, when people said, this is what the Prophet ﷺ did, people did not listen. They rebelled. And that rebellion is exactly what gave birth to the Muslim manosphere. They took the logic of empire's colonial masculinity, put it into a neoliberal framework, and its obsessions with hierarchy, dominance, control, and we rebranded it as Islamic victimhood. They said, we are the true masculine men, us Muslim men. We are morally superior, but socially subordinate. The world has elevated these weak, effeminate, dayuth, morally bankrupt men above us. But one day, our time will come and we will rule and dominate everything. It's the Tarzan narrative all over again. Change the jungle to urban jungle. Change apes to non-Muslim men. Except you're not Tarzan, bro. You're not white. You don't have access to the same state power, to the military, to the media, to global institutions. But still, you identify with that masculinity. Why? Because you've inherited its framework, because you're not looking outside of your train. And here's the irony. Our communities don't even have the financial standing to live up to the masculine provider fantasy. But instead of critiquing that fantasy, you turn your anger inward, and you blame your own people for not letting you dominate them. So what do? You affiliate vertically. You reach for those who do have that power. White conservative men like Jordan Peterson and other traditionalists. Maybe now you say, well, he said bad things about Muslims now. We don't support him anymore. Yeah, you're upset that he, quote, flipped and became an open Zionist. But the truth is, his Jabarut logic was always Zionist. You just didn't see it because it was dressed up as masculine moral clarity. His entire lectures organizes order and chaos in masculine and feminine. So when he opposed feminism, when he opposed liberalism, when he opposed leftists, whatever, when he's talking about restoring order, restoring masculine order, when he said to you,
we're on the same team. Those feminist women are hurting us. We believe in a masculine hierarchy. We share your pain.
Our community believed him. He didn't even have to recruit you. You came willingly. And then he told you exactly what to do. Turn your frustration inward, onto your own women folk, onto your children, onto your communities. Practice control, rehearse submission, discipline them. So that when it came to restore the global order of Western white supremacy, He put you in his iron sights. You mistook proximity to power for solidarity, but they never saw you as equals. Jordan Peterson never saw you as a masculine man that's equal to him. He believes in a masculine hierarchy, yes, but he never saw you as part of it. You're just cannon fodder. That's why he became and always was a Zionist, not despite of his masculine views, but because of it. And if you think that's an exaggeration, if you still want to believe that he just lost his way, then listen to him in his own words before he flipped on Muslims.
It seems to me that it's sane women who have to stand up against their crazy sisters and say, look, enough of that, enough man-hating, enough pathology, enough bringing disgrace on us as a gender. But the problem there, and then I'll stop my little tirade, is that most of the women I know who are sane are busy doing sane things, right? They're off, they have their career, they have their family, they're quite occupied, and they don't seem to have the time or maybe even the interest to go after their crazy harpy sisters. And so I don't see any regulating force for that terrible femininity. And it seems to me to be invading the culture and undermining the masculine power of the culture in a way that's, I think, fatal. I really do believe that.
I too believe that this is symptomatic of the decline of Western culture, and it will just go down flat. I don't think people realize that masculinity still exists, okay, in the world as a code among jihadists, okay, and when you have passionate masculinity, okay, circling the borders like the Huns and the Vandals during the Roman Empire. That's what I see. I see this culture rotting from within, okay, and disemboweling itself, literally.
I think you're absolutely right. Luckily, we've been, what would you call, invaded by stupid terrorists instead of smart terrorists, because a smart terrorist could do an unbelievable amount of damage in a very short period of time. So, and it's just God's good graces that hasn't happened yet. And so...
Yeah, and then what will happen is that it's the men, okay? The men will reconstruct civilization while the women cower in the houses and have the men go out and do all the dirty work. That's what's going to happen again. Only men will bring civilization back again. Okay?
This isn't just gender commentary. It's civilizational theology. He's plainly telling you, feminism is civilizational rot. Muslim masculinity is threatening unless it's subordinate to his white Western empire. Only men, his kind of men, deserve to rebuild and control the world. You thought you were his allies, but he always saw you as barbarians at the gate. He was never inviting you in. He was preparing to put you down like a dog.
As Jews in Israel, are you telling the greatest story ever told? Well, you decide that by how you live. And that decision will affect the world, because everyone looks here for one reason or another. It's not so easy to understand. Everyone looks here to see, well, how are you actually doing under this tremendous assault of adversarial criticism? And I think it is true in some real sense that the fate of the world depends on the decisions of the people of Israel, just as the fate of the world depends on the decision of every individual. So you make yourself a shining light on the hill, right? You attract people here because of what you're capable of doing. You show the world what the holy city could look like, because we need it. We need it, and it's up to you to do it.
And Andrew Tate, it's the same script. You liked him when he attacked women. You only backed off when he crossed you. But both of those times, you used him and Jordan Peterson to validate the same wounded, victimized Muslim masculinity narrative. You didn't adopt their ideas because they were Islamic. You adopted their masculine political theology because it gave you a shadow of the same imperial masculinity, just localized, racialized, dressed up enough to feel like some smidge of power. But when you act out, when your version of restoring order spills over, they will discipline you next. Because you were never Tarzan. You were just a stand-in, a subcontractor, a useful enforcer, a disposable person. And when they're done with you, they will say, like Jordan Peterson did and Andrew Tate said, these brown men are unstable, uncivilized. They're threats to our women, our democracy, our God-given order. The prisons will open up, the drones will fly, and the Jabarūt you thought you were inheriting will consume you. So when you say they're abusing masculinity but refuse to challenge the structure it's built on, you're not resisting colonial empire, you're replicating it. You won't use that power to fight injustice. You'll turn it on the softest targets, your women, your children, your elderly. You'll call it protection. You'll say it's discipline, but it'll be punishment in disguise. And when that microcosm becomes a political theology, you'll act exactly like the oppressors you claim to hate. And you won't even recognize it. Because to you, it won't look like oppression. In your eyes, it will look like divine order, like righteousness, like purity, like Muslim masculinity fulfilled. And maybe, just maybe, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is withholding power from us right now on purpose. Not to humiliate us, but to protect us, to stop us from reproducing the very logic of al-Jabarūt we think we're resisting, just with a different skin color, with a beard, and Islamic tongues. Allah narrates to us what Musa a.s. said to his people. Perhaps your Lord will destroy your enemies and make you successors in the land to see what you will do. That's not a promise. It's a test, a divine warning, a mirror. It's not just about leadership, but about humility, about whether we can hold power without turning it into punishment, about whether we can inherit the land without inheriting Pharaoh's logic, the logic of al-Jabarūt, the system of Fir'aun. Because if you think the only problem is who holds power, not the structure of power itself, nor the logic that justifies it, then you're no different than Qarun. He believed he was chosen, that his wealth, his prestige, his knowledge of masculinity, and being able to live out being masculine were signs of divine favor. He said, I was only given it because of knowledge I have. Did he not know that Allah had destroyed before him of generations those who were greater than him in power and greater in wealth? So if you look at the world today and you use the manosphere narrative, they're corrupt. But if men like me, real men, real masculine Muslim men were on top, it would all be fine. Then you've already failed the test. Because in your heart, you're not resisting Qarun, you're envying him. And when the day comes, when you do receive power, you won't build justice. You'll build prisons. You'll justify cruelty. And you'll call it dawah. And you'll think you're doing God's work. And you won't even realize you've become what you once claimed to stand against. Because you were never chasing justice to begin with. You were chasing power. You just wanted it in halal packaging for someone to sell you this masculinity at a price, and you took the exchange. So now we have to stop and really ask ourselves, what did it cost us? That fleeting rush of feeling like a man. That seductive moment of playing Tarzan, imagining ourselves as inherently superior, built to rule. The thrill of narrating to the public like Winston and being believed without question. Of reclaiming dominance in the home like Falwell, or in society like Reagan. Of verbally beating down our own women like Peterson and Tate, just to extract sexual obedience dressed up as love. But they betrayed us. Every one of them. They turned their backs, not just on us, but on truth, on justice, and everything sacred. And still we followed. For what? For a fantasy so hollow, it was sold in slogans and brain-rot discourse. And now we see how that fantasy was weaponized. How it gave the world the tone, the posture, the rationality to pressure or persuade entire nations into blessing the Holocaust of Gaza. Not just some Western nations. Some nations jumped willingly, eager to prove their alignment with white supremacist power, even though they were neither white nor Western. Others saw our people's blood not as a tragedy, but as a transaction, a means to fulfill their masculine need to provide, to broker arms, influence, and oil-soaked alliances as a symbol of national virility. And some institutions, even those that claim neutrality, folded beneath the pressure. They bowed to the masculine imperative to appear strong, to side with domination, to punish resistance, to affirm that the destruction of Gaza was not just justified, but necessary, strategic, and sane. But to them, restraint was weakness, and silence was survival. So we're left with a question we can no longer afford to ignore. Did our desires to feel powerful, to grasp even a shadow of masculine supremacy, make us blind to the logic of al-Jabarūt, now crushing our ummah? Did we choose the illusion of innate superiority, even if it meant forfeiting the moral clarity to see who our real oppressors are? And in adopting that logic, that voice, that posture, did we become the very men the world despises, not because of who we are as brown, men of color, Muslim men, but because we started mirroring, imitating the very people who step on our ummah day in, day out? So we return to the question that started this video. What if the masculinity we defend in the name of Islam is the very Jabarut logic that's oppressing Palestinian men and our ummah across the globe? Conclusion to the first installment. We covered a lot in this video, from the speech that justifies lynching by George T. Winston, to Falwell's rebranding of segregation as religious liberty, to Reagan's masculine restoration through anti-welfare politics, prison and policing, and interventions across the globe, to the civilized masculinity of Zionism, and finally, to the quiet way all of that logic sneaks into our own Muslim discourse, wrapped in Fitrah, disguised as divine order, proven by stats and data and evolution. Because what we've seen is this: Qawwamah didn't fall apart just because of modernity. It's being rebuilt by it. And we're not aware of the bricks we're using, engineered by empire and repackaged through sciences with racial supremacy origins, Christian complementarianism, and now Muslim discourse. So when someone says, men are naturally built to lead, now we have to ask, built by what? Shaped by who? In service of whose order? Because once you follow that logic, you'll see it's not the Qur'an that's speaking. It's the ghost of Winston, the voice of Falwell, the violence of Reagan, dressed up as peace. Now it's speaking Arabic. But this is only half the picture. So far we focused on the myth of natural masculinity, how it was crafted, coded, and carried by empire. In the next installment, we're going deeper. We're going to talk about how this logic is defended by looking at pre-modern tafsirs. We'll look at how classical scholars, shaped by the sciences of their time, imported ideas from humor theory, Aristotelian cosmology, and assumptions about men in their readings of the Qur'an, not to discard the tradition, but to disentangle it. We'll ask, when does tafsir become tadabbur? And are we even aware when it ebbs and flows within the same text? When does interpretation truly reflect the Qur'an? And when does it simply reflect the train we're riding? And how and why are those same tafsirs being used today to defend Western social hierarchies, under the banner of Islam. Because if we don't ask those questions, if we don't examine where our readings come from and who they serve, we risk mistaking domination for piety and building our manhood to serve the thrones of al-Jabarūt,